Okay, but let's look at that. So the tissue gets healed. What that means is that the cells on either side of the tear get involved in cellular synthesis and begin to operate, right? And they begin to like, do things, right? So it's not that you are physically fixing the tear like sewing it up. It's that you're inspiring the cells to do their work. And so it's physical in that sense, right? Because you are actually stimulating cellular synthesis in their body through your intention. Does that make sense? Yeah. Right? So it's very physical. It has real physical results. Yeah. Zane.
I was thinking another thing that, like following that question, like a lot of the work I've been trained to do with Michael Harner is sort of asking, you're basically, there's, like what he would suggest is that there's disembodied beings.
Yes.
And they want to affect some sort of change in the world.
Yes.
But that they can't do that for some reason. So they have to come along and find someone who they can do it through. So somehow, because I'm embodied, they can come through me and do these throughout these various levels.
That's right.
Affect more change.
That's right. So if we go back to this diagram, so there are these disembodied beings out here which don't have physical bodies, and apparently it is difficult for these kind of beings to get information about what's happening in the waking world. Right? It apparently requires some kind of particular meditative work on their part to sort of reach down. But it's much easier for them to gain access to, let's say, your sense consciousness, which is also already at their level. So if they can get involved with you, they can use your senses and your motor organs to gain information and to have action in the world that would be very difficult for them to have directly. So apparently it's extremely difficult for a being up here, let's say, to communicate directly with a being here or even with a macromolecule. But it's fairly easy for them to communicate with your sense consciousness or your organ consciousness. And so through an embodied being, a disembodied being can have much more effect and more easily in the waking world than it can directly. So that would fit with what Michael Harner is saying exactly.
So that's channeling?
Yeah, exactly. Channeling. Yeah, exactly. That's channeling, basically, yeah.
And again, it reminds me just how much, like how many people are struggling in their lives trying to, because their rational mind can't place what's going on in their experience. And sort of that dignifying, like you said yesterday.
That's right.
Like giving dignity to their experience.
That's right. Yeah, and you see, because right now we have two different ways of speaking about the world. We have the scientific way, which is the most privileged way in our society. It's practically our religion. And the scientific story starts from here and works down. Right? And so it doesn't give us a language for discussing our actual experience. But by expanding our cosmology to include these different levels, we now have a language which lets us describe our experience, and it doesn't exclude this. Right? So when people start talking about, channeling and psychic healing, right? Scientists label them as flakes, right? And part of that is because the language of psychic phenomena and the language of science have been incommensurable. So in effect, they sound crazy to each other. But with this language, we can see that it's all one reality. And we don't have to be crazy. We can really honor science, which is important because here we are in a technological world, and we can honor our psychic reality. And so it's a huge benefit for sanity. Yeah. Right? And it does allow us to dignify our subjective experience because we affect each other directly all the time. It's just, so. I had this experience once. I have a friend who's very, very scientific and really, into common sense. And we love each other, but he often thinks I'm a little bit crazy, And so I was sitting with him one day at a restaurant. I was going through a period where I was just very sexual, and all I could think about was sex. And he's not a very sexual guy, And so we're sitting in a restaurant, and this waitress, and we're having a discussion about telepathy. And he's saying, no, there's no such thing as telepathy. If you think there is, it's just coincidence, right? And so we're sitting there, and the waitress comes over. And the waitress is not very attractive, particularly. But all I can see is a woman there. And I start thinking about her sex life, you know, and what she'd be like in bed and stuff, right? And I don't say anything. And my friend turns to me and says, you know, he says, I don't usually think about these things, but I was just noticing her as a sexual presence, right? And this is in the middle of his denying telepathy. He's picking up my thoughts, right, and feeding them back to me, and it's just so funny, you know. Yeah. But these things happen, right? We do transmit our moods and thoughts to each other all the time. And if we don't recognize that, we're just deliberately blinding ourselves to reality. Yeah. All right, any other questions?
I just think we have to have like a whole school on morals of
Oh,
once we get into
yes.
these worlds, like, is it okay to think this way about that person, or you know, or
Yes.
help them with their hand? If I don't know, it's just the whole moral.
Exactly.
Ethics, yeah.
The ethics are very, very interesting. It requires us to reconsider the whole thing, right? Because we have an ethical, you know, on the one hand, people say, well, it's just what you do that counts, it's not what you think. Well, that's not exactly true. But then people go the other way, and they think, well, if you covet your neighbor's wife, even in thought, you're going to go to hell. Well, that doesn't work either, right? Because we have to acknowledge that we are not the whole of who we are. So, you know, there's a thing called Gestalt psychology, a big movement back in the 60s and 70s. And what they would do is they would do these like dream work in which you would become every person in your dream. And the idea was that really it was all you. And so the work was to try to reabsorb everything into this huge bloated ego that became the whole thing. That's not the way it is. Right? We consist of matter at different grades. We consist of intelligence that functions differently. And so the vital part of our being is not ethical. It just isn't. Only our mental parts are ethical. And so our mental parts that are ethical have to find some way of accommodating our vital parts that aren't. And that the whole yogic work, the whole work of evolution concerns, at this stage of our evolution, the tension between our ethical mind and our unethical vital. How do we transform that relationship? But we can't think we're going to go to hell just because our vital body has a desire. It's not ethical, right? So all this has to be rethought. Very, very interesting work to be done. Yeah, good point. Yes, Josephina.
Just this brings to mind what you're talking about, ethics and the idea of hell and heaven.
Yes.
How does this kind of model coincide or denies a model like the Christian model, for example?
Well, Christian, that's too vague, but if we talk about Catholic, the Catholic model gives us a soul, but the soul begins in time and doesn't end in time, which is pretty weird, right? So the soul starts at birth and it goes on forever, and then there's a life, and then we die, and then we either go to heaven or we go to hell, where we live forever. Right? Now, we can draw this model in these terms, but whether it's aesthetically or intellectually appealing, that's a whole other question. Right? I find it completely incoherent. Right? It's sort of an abomination to suggest that the conditions of life, which are not chosen, would lead to an infinity of damnation or beatitude is just, I don't like the idea. I don't want to live in that universe. But we can't express it in these terms. Yeah.
Well, the Catholic faith, in fact, doesn't. It always talks about the body, because you go to hell and you suffer bodily, you're burned forever. Or if you go to heaven, you will resuscitate someday and live I don't know where.
Right.
But it's always talking of the body.
Well, I guess so am I, though, because there's a vital body and a mental body. There's
Yeah, but
always body.
It's not this body, I think. I don't think the
That's not
Catholic.
the, I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't.
I don't know what the Catholic doctrine is. I don't know how important it is in Catholic thought. And all I'll say is we can express it in this language.
Yeah.
But anything else? Okay, great.